In the heart of the Renaissance, a time of great change and intrigue, the city of Ferrara, Italy, was a hub of luxury and power. But beneath its grandeur lay a web of conflict and betrayal that could turn any nobleman's life upside down in an instant. One such nobleman, Felino Sandeo, found himself at the center of a storm of controversy and political maneuvering. Felino Sandeo was a respected teacher of canon law at the prestigious universities of Ferrara and Pisa. In 1484, he moved to Rome to become an auditor of the Sacred Rota, a high court of the Catholic Church. Despite his distance from Ferrara, he never severed his ties with the city and its ruling family, the Este. The Este, led by Duke Hercules, were known for their shrewd and sometimes ruthless governance. In 1487 and 1497, Felino faced a significant challenge. Duke Hercules, known for his ambition, asked Felino to give up some of his church positions, or benefices, so that the Duke could assign them to his favorites. Felino, a principled man, refused. The Duke, not one to be easily thwarted, brought the matter to an ecclesiastical court. Surprisingly, the court ruled in Felino's favor, but the victory was short-lived. In 1498, when Felino realized he needed the Duke's support to become a cardinal, it was too late. The Duke had already chosen a loyal courtier, Giovanni Luca Casalini, for the position. Felino never became a cardinal, a bitter reminder of the power dynamics at play. The same year, 1498, brought another significant event to Ferrara. The general chapter of the Dominican order was held in the city, and a plenary indulgence was granted to those who confessed, received communion, and gave alms. However, the mood was somber. Girolamo Savonarola, a famous Dominican friar from Ferrara, had been executed in Florence earlier that year. The people of Ferrara were outraged. An anonymous chronicler noted, "The general of the friars and a pope's representative have unjustly condemned Girolamo to death, and for this reason all the people or almost of Ferrara were angry with those friars." The people of Ferrara were largely illiterate, and their anger stemmed from a sense of local pride, rather than a deep understanding of the theological debates surrounding Savonarola. This local pride often fueled conflicts between different groups, whether it was the people of Ferrara against foreigners, families vying for the favor of the prince, or monastic orders competing for influence. Felino Sandeo, despite his high standing, was not immune to these conflicts. He was a fierce critic of Savonarola, and this only added to the Duke's antipathy towards him. The relationships between secular and religious authorities in Ferrara were complex and nuanced. While the Este family had significant power, they often had to navigate a delicate balance of compromises, mediations, and negotiations with the church and other powerful factions. In 1499, the city of Ferrara faced yet another challenge. The Este family, always looking to expand their influence, found themselves entangled in the political machinations of the time. The Duke's decisions, often driven by personal and political ambitions, had far-reaching consequences for the people of Ferrara and the region as a whole. The story of Ferrara during the Renaissance is one of power, pride, and the intricate interplay between secular and religious authorities. It is a tale of individuals like Felino Sandeo, who stood up for their principles, and the complex dynamics that shaped the fate of a city and its people. In the bustling, sun-drenched halls of the Convento in Malta, the Hospitaller Order of St. John was more than just a military institution. It was a living, breathing entity that fused spiritual fervor with martial might. This chapter delves into the world of the order, exploring how it fostered a generation of holy warriors and created a sacred space where the line between faith and violence blurred. The story of young Agostino Grimaldi Iraso offers a rare glimpse into the early life of a boy destined to become a Knight of Malta. At just 6 years old, Agostino was chosen by his father to join the order. His early years were marked by a deep piety that set him apart. Agostino would often be found alone in the garden, meditating on the Passion of Christ, a behavior that seemed unusual for a child his age. His mother, though proud, was also concerned, as she saw the growing intensity of his devotion and the responsibilities that came with it. Agostino's education was rigorous, combining religious instruction with martial training. He was taught to see his future role as a knight as a sacred duty, a way to defend the faith and earn eternal salvation. This transformation was not unique to Agostino. The Order of St. John had a well-structured system to prepare young men for their roles as both warriors and spiritual leaders. Not all knights, however, embodied the ideal of piety and martial prowess. Fra Gabriel du Bois Laferte, for example, was a reserved and somewhat frail young man who struggled with seasickness. Despite these challenges, his deep devotion to the faith and his involvement in devotional circles in Malta earned him a place among the order's saints. Even when his character was called into question during the Inquisition, his spiritual attributes were still celebrated. The order's tolerance for character flaws was not universal. Fra Leon Strozzi and Fra Alurimo Parpaglia were both known for their violent deeds. Strozzi, a powerful and ruthless knight, orchestrated high-profile assassinations, but never faced the same scrutiny as others due to his military prowess and family name. Parpaglia, on the other hand, was a man of violent retribution, avenging his brother's death by killing the assassin. Despite his past, Parpaglia's daring attempt to assassinate the Ottoman leader during the siege of Malta earned him a place among the order's saints, showcasing the complex balance between piety and violence. The Conventual Church in Malta was more than just a place of worship. It was a visual classroom designed to instill the order's values into the minds of its young recruits. The church's opulent Baroque decorations were not merely for show. They served a pedagogical purpose, teaching and moving the viewer. Upon entering the oratory dedicated to the beheading of St. John, the first thing a novice would see was Caravaggio's iconic painting of the beheading of St. John the Baptist. The gory scene, with its stark chiaroscuro, was a powerful reminder of the ultimate sacrifice. The blood on the saint's neck and the blade in the executioner's hand were symbols of the fate that awaited those who stood firm in their faith. The semicircular lunette above the painting showed the martyrdom of the last defenders of Fort St. Elmo, reinforcing the idea that death was not a final end but a step towards eternal life. The floor of the oratory, with its intricate marble inlay, was a constant reminder of mortality. The high relief of the sorrowful Mother of God at the top of the oratory depicted the Virgin Mary watching her son die on the cross. This image resonated with the mothers of young knights, who had to watch their sons leave for a life of service and potential martyrdom. The Conventual Church was a sacred space where the spiritual and the martial converged. It taught the novices that their lives were not their own, but belonged to the faith they served. The Order of St. John, through its rigorous training and powerful symbols, created a generation of knights who saw their military service as a holy calling, a path to spiritual fulfillment and eternal glory. The Hospitaller Order of St. John was a unique institution that combined the ideals of piety and martial prowess, fostering a generation of holy warriors who saw their service as a sacred duty. The Conventual Church in Malta, with its rich Baroque decorations and powerful symbols, was a visual classroom that reinforced these values, preparing young men for a life of service and sacrifice. In this sacred space, the line between faith and violence blurred, creating a unique and powerful institution that would shape the course of religious warfare in the early modern period. The spirituality of the sanctuary or parish wasn't just tied to the walls of a church building. The Holy Infirmary, which we would call a hospital today, was also considered holy ground and enjoyed many of the same privileges as a church. But perhaps the most fascinating transformation was that of the galley, the Hospitaller's main worship. This galley wasn't just a vessel of war, it was also a sacred space, a place for spiritual exercise and care for the souls of those on board. Fra Fabrizio Cagliola, a conventual chaplain, wrote a guide for his fellow chaplains called Istruzioni a Fra Capellani Gerusallimitani. This guide helped chaplains understand their duties on the galley, which was like a parish at sea. The chaplain had to be approved by the prior of the Conventual Church and was bound by the vow of obedience. They were also expected to bring along all the necessary items for their liturgical duties, like liturgical dress. On board, the chaplain worked closely with the captain and the crew. It was important for the chaplain to be friendly, but not too informal. They had to maintain a balance, using their charisma to win the trust and respect of the knights and crew. The chaplain had to be firm but fair, especially when it came to discipline. For example, they had to address any dishonest remarks or swearing, but they were advised to reprimand knights privately to avoid offending their honor. After the Council of Trent, the rosary became a powerful symbol of victory at sea, especially after the Battle of Lepanto in 1571. Pope Pius V believed that the victory was due to the intercession of the Virgin Mary, who had been invoked through the Rosary. The chaplain on a Hospitaller galley was responsible for gathering the men to recite the Rosary daily. Every Saturday and the eve of important feasts were celebrated with special prayers and fasting. The chaplain also had to care for the sick and wounded. They worked closely with the surgeon to ensure that the wounded could confess at any time. If a crew member was dying, the chaplain was expected to visit them frequently, providing comfort and ensuring they received the sacraments. The chaplain's goal was to help the dying person die well, ensuring their soul's salvation. When a Christian died, the chaplain had to perform a proper burial, either on land or at sea, with all the necessary prayers. If a Muslim was dying, the chaplain was instructed to try to persuade them to convert to Christianity. The chaplain would remind them that without converting, their soul would go to hell, but by converting, they could enter paradise. During battles, the chaplain played a crucial role. They were responsible for listening to as many confessions as possible before the fighting began. If the fighting started, the chaplain could choose to stay below deck to assist the wounded or go on deck to encourage the fighters. If they chose to go on deck, they would hold a crucifix and remind the men that dying in battle for their faith would ensure their soul's salvation. The language of war was deeply spiritual. The Hospitallers believed that their battles were not just physical, but also spiritual. They saw themselves as defenders of the Christian faith, and the idea of martyrdom was a powerful motivator. Stories of knights who suffered and died for their faith were used to inspire others to remain steadfast. However, the reality of capture and torture was a real fear. Many Christian captives were subjected to brutal treatment, and some were forced to convert to Islam. The Order of St. John was aware that many conversions were not genuine, and were made out of fear or for personal gain. Chaplains were instructed to be cautious and not baptize converts, unless they were dying or had been properly educated in the faith. Despite the violence and fear, there were also moments of humanity. Some accounts describe how Muslim captors allowed Christian captives to hold religious ceremonies, recognizing that religion provided comfort and made the captives more manageable. These stories show that the relationship between Christians and Muslims, while often marked by conflict, was more complex than simple hatred. In the end, the chaplain on a Hospitaller galley was not just a religious figure, but also a caregiver, a counselor, and a source of strength for the crew. Their role was essential in maintaining the spiritual well-being of those on board, ensuring that the galley remained a floating parish, a place where the faith could be practiced and the souls of the crew could find peace. In the 16th and 17th centuries, the Knights of St. John, also known as the Hospitallers, faced many challenges. One of the most significant was the constant threat from the Ottoman Turks, who were expanding their empire and often clashed with Christian forces. The Hospitallers, based on the island of Malta, were a military and religious order. They believed it was their duty to protect Christians and fight against the Turks, even if it meant risking their lives. A historian named Bartolomeo dal Pazzo wrote about a brave Hospitaller knight who, during a naval battle in 1606, refused to leave a wounded fellow knight behind. Despite the danger, he helped his friend, leading to both being captured by the Turks. Even in captivity, this knight remained strong in his faith. He wore the cross of the order, shared his food with other Christian slaves, and never asked for ransom, seeing his captivity as a chance to prove his faith and earn a place in heaven. Eventually, he was ransomed after 18 months. Another example is Fra Rinaldo Lebec Labassiere, who was captured in 1625 and spent 10 years as a slave in Tripoli. Upon his return to Malta, he was seen as a saint, living a holy life until his death. These stories show how the Hospitallers viewed their captivity as a test of faith, much like martyrdom, which could bring them closer to God. However, the Hospitallers and other Christians sometimes struggled to understand why they faced defeats despite their strong faith. In 1571, a letter was sent to Emperor Maximilian, asking why God seemed to be on the side of the Turk. The author of the letter suggested that God was not with the Christians because they were divided by heresies and lived sinful lives. He pointed out that while the Turks were disciplined and focused, the Christian camps were filled with vice and greed. The letter also suggested that if all Christian princes united, they could field a larger and more powerful army against the Turks. This unity, however, was often difficult to achieve due to political rivalries. Meanwhile, the Christian world was also divided by internal conflicts. Martin Luther's 95 Theses sparked the Protestant Reformation, leading to widespread religious wars between Catholics and Protestants. Anton Francesco Cini, a contemporary writer, described the Civil War in France as a heartbreaking struggle where families turned against each other. The violence was extreme, and even theologians struggled to justify the brutality. In response, Jesuit priests like him and Augur and Antonio Passavino wrote manuals to guide soldiers in ethical conduct, emphasizing that waging war was part of a knight's vocation, but must be done with a clear conscience and care for the poor and sick. Fra Giovanni Battista Lamarinier de Cani, a leading figure in the Order of St. John, reopened a retreat house in 1685 to prepare knights spiritually. In his treatise, he echoed the teachings of the Jesuits, arguing that knights should be joyful in both victory and martyrdom. He stressed that a knight's vocation included both fighting and caring for the sick, and that true holiness came from fulfilling both roles. The Hospitallers believed that God had ultimate control over their fate, whether in victory or defeat. This belief is evident in the account of the 1552 attack on Zora, where the vanguard's greed led to their downfall, while the virtuous knights, despite their sacrifice, were seen as earning greater merit in God's eyes. These stories and teachings show that the Hospitallers lived in a complex world, where faith and violence were deeply intertwined. They saw their battles as divine tests and their lives as opportunities to serve God, even in the most challenging circumstances. The story of religious persecution in England during the Restoration period, from 1660 to 1688, is a tale of tension and struggle. When Charles II returned to the throne in 1660, many hoped for a more tolerant and open society. However, the reality was quite different. The king and his government aimed to create a strong, unified church, which meant that other religious groups, like the Quakers and Puritans, faced harsh treatment. One of the most striking examples of this persecution involved soldiers being used to intimidate and punish religious dissenters. In 1686, a group of Quakers was meeting in Leicester when a group of soldiers burst in, drank, and even attacked the congregation. This wasn't an isolated incident. Soldiers were often used to break up religious gatherings and arrest those who didn't conform to the established church. But why did the government use soldiers in this way? It was a time when the idea of a standing army soldiers who were paid and ready for action even in peacetime was becoming more common in Europe. Kings and rulers found that having a powerful army could help them control their own people, not just fight foreign enemies. In France, for example, King Louis XIV used his soldiers, known as dragonnades, to force Protestants to convert to Catholicism. The fear of similar tactics being used in England was real and intense. However, the use of soldiers to suppress religion in England was not as widespread or brutal as in some other countries. In France, the dragonnades led to the near elimination of the Protestant Huguenots, while in the Habsburg territories, such as Austria and Bohemia, the Catholic Church reasserted its dominance through military force. In England, the government faced significant resistance and criticism from the public, who were well aware of what was happening on the continent. The fear of religious persecution and the use of soldiers to enforce it played a significant role in the events leading up to the Glorious Revolution of 1688. When James II, Charles II's brother, became king, he continued and even intensified the persecution of dissenters. This, along with his attempts to restore Catholicism, led to widespread outrage. In 1688, a group of parliamentarians invited William of Orange, a Protestant, to take the throne. When William and his wife Mary accepted, James II fled, and the monarchy was re-established on the condition that it would respect the rights and liberties of its subjects. The Glorious Revolution marked a turning point in English history. It led to the Bill of Rights in 1689, which established the principle that the king could not suspend laws without the consent of Parliament. It also paved the way for greater religious tolerance, although it took time for full equality to be achieved. In the end, the limited use of soldiers to suppress religious dissent in England during the Restoration period shows that while the government had the means to enforce strict religious conformity, it also faced strong opposition from its people. The events of 1688 and 1689 highlight the importance of the rule of law and the protection of individual rights, lessons that continue to resonate today.